Okay, welcome back. We're back here and with David Ryan, of course, and we're going to, well, first of all, let's talk about what we just went over. We went over categories and catalysts, and we talked about the various categories that we focus on and the characteristics of those various categories. Now, again, I want to point out that we're just giving perspective here. And this next topic, we're going to talk about valuation. And valuation, really, we're not value buyers. And you know, when you're a growth stock trader, you know, you're going to be by default in stocks that have high PEs and look like they're expensive. That's what we talked about earlier, that the leaders usually look expensive. But when you have a stock that has a really high growth rate, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more when we talk about the fundamentals, but when you have a really high growth rate, it's very hard to put an appropriate valuation on these stocks. And that's why valuation doesn't matter that much when you're dealing with a stock that's growing at, like Cisco Systems, when it was growing very rapidly back in the 90s, they had 16 quarters of triple-digit earnings. Now, you can do that math. I mean, even if you're a plumber, or maybe you have a small business and maybe your sales are, I don't know, $500,000 or $600,000 a year of revenue. Take that number and then times it by 100 and do that every 3 months for the next 16 quarters. Okay, so every 3 months you take your revenue, you would take a look at how big your company would be at the end of that, and then you'll see why a stock can make such a big move. So we're going to talk about valuation and how it relates to super performance. And again, if you know some of these if you're a value buyer, and I can't really talk from a value standpoint because you're certainly not Bill Miller or somebody that's good at value investing. But if you have a very low, growth rate, then you can put an appropriate PE on there because the company is growing so slow and usually have more visibility. When you're growing at 100%, the visibility is so limited. And same thing on the downside. I mean, if those companies falter, they can have a big problem because there's so much growth that's baked into the price. So let's talk about this. I don't know if Dave, I don't know if you have anything to say to start off here, but
well, I think the most important thing is that the greatest winners of all time, a majority of them. I mean, and maybe it's I don't know exactly the exact figure, but I mean I know it's like 75-80% had. I think the average PE of a super performance stock was twice that of the S&P 500. So if you were going to say, well, I'm only going to buy stocks that have a PE ratio that is the same or less than the S&P 500, you right there might have eliminated all the great winners of, the greatest winners of all time out of your portfolio if you won't pay more than what the S&P is valued at.
Yeah, and that's a good way to start here by taking a look at. We all know this company, right, called Yahoo. Well, back in the 1990s, when I was first buying this, I was buying it in 1997, and I had institutional clients at the time, and I was trying to convince some of them that Yahoo was a stock they should consider, and they said Yahoo. Nobody knew Yahoo. And the real problem is that this stock was trading at 938 times earnings at the time. So that stock went up 8,000% over the next couple of years. And then it was trading at 1,700 times earnings. So again, these stock now just to point out, this was the birth of the internet, or in the beginning stages of a very exciting area, of a super high growth area, and the unfolding of what we know today as one of the greatest technological advances ever. At the time, there was a whole bunch of stocks that were setting up and breaking out of bases and going into new high ground and had these high PEs, and nobody understood why. They couldn't because they really didn't understand the internet too well. And Amazon was another one of them. Amazon was coming out of a base in 1997, and many of these had super astronomical PEs. Now, I don't even look at the PE usually. I mean, I look at it and I know what it is, but it doesn't even come into play with me unless it's a really low PE. So let's just say, the general market is the S&P is at 22 times earnings, and a stock is at 4 times earnings, and it's a very, very low P. That could mean there's something really wrong, or it's some industry, some very strangely valued industry. So that would be suspicious to me. I like to see a PE that's above the market, and there's a premium. But again, it doesn't really matter. Even if it was a little bit below, I'm really not using the PE as any type of criteria that's going to make me buy a stock or not buy a stock, except, like I said, if it's exceptionally low. Dave, how are you looking at the PE? Are you using it at all?
No, I'm rarely ever looking at the PE. And I was going to say, after working for 17 years at William O'Neill and Company, and working with Bill O'Neill, he never said, "Oh, we can't buy the stock because the PE is too high." We would only be concentrating on what were the size of those earnings, those quarterly earnings and those annual earnings. Well, how big were those increases quarter after quarter, and what is the 3 to 5 year growth rate? That's what we really focused on, and it never came up in a discussion about a PE being too high. He might actually look at the length of the move, how many times the stock had been up, and how long it had been going, but he wouldn't be sitting there trying to put a valuation on the stock.
Right. So later on, when we get into sell rules, that's a very good point that David just brought up. When we get into the sell rules, there is one way we're going to look at the PE, but we're not really looking at it as a valuation. We're looking at PE expansion. And if the PE expands by a certain amount, it could be an indication that the stock has come a long way, and let you know that it's late stage. So that's going to be later on, and we will talk about that. But like I said, there's only a couple ways that we look at the PE, but we're not saying, the valuation, and we're looking at it. So if it's trading at 32 times earnings, or it's trading 1.5 times the S&P, or the growth rate versus the PE, we're not looking at that in a vacuum. So now another thing I want to talk about, and that is, if you start looking at stocks as expensive and cheap, you get into a real problem, especially when you're buying a stock because the stock is cheap. The problem is that if that stock rolls over on you and comes in and starts producing a loss, it gets cheaper. So the whole reason why you bought it actually gets more appetizing. So if you loved it, a PE of 20 and the stock was trading at 60, well, you really got to love it right at 30, right? If it cuts in half and the PE is even lower and it's even more of a value, and that's what I call the cheap trap, where you get caught into this. The reason why you bought it was cheap. So if it goes down, it's even cheaper, and that makes you start buying stocks and averaging down and buying stocks that are losers, or buying stocks that are falling, and that could get you in a lot of trouble, especially when you're investing in high performing growth stocks. And David and I were just talking about this before, prior to coming on here, and there's a rule. Some of you might have heard me talk about the 50-80 rule. And that rule basically states that, and this is from looking at all the leading stocks going back cycle after cycle after cycle, and looking at these big secular leaders and what happens after they top. And what we found was about 50% of them will go down 80%. And about 80% of them will go down about 50%, or at least 50%, and the average decline is over 70%. So when you're in these high flyers, there's a lot of risk. So you got to cut your loss. You got to cut your loss, get out of there, and not start making a case because the stock is cheaper and the original reason you bought it was cheap, and now it's cheaper, because it could get a heck of a lot cheaper. And we're just taking a look at AIG here. This was, of course, at a time where we had the crisis, and all the bank stocks rolled over and got in big trouble. And a lot of analysts were like, "Oh, it's trading at these historical low 10-year, 20-year low PEs, and trading 52-week lows, and buying these things, and they all just imploded." Some of these stocks, even the ones that survived, that didn't go under, are still 20 years later didn't even get back to break even. We're going to look at a couple of those in just a minute here. So you got to remember, every 20%, 30%, 50% decline starts as a 5%, 8%, or a 10% loss. It starts as what looks like a not so big deal, and if you sit there and you don't address it, it can become a big deal very quickly. And it doesn't matter the quality. And Dave, I would like you to talk about, people think, if you buy a quality company, you buy GE or IBM, we can go back over time and find, the Amazons and the Googles of the day of, say, in the 90s or even in the 80s or the 70s, and you go all the way back, and there was always some companies that you felt like you could, they were bulletproof, right? I mean, yeah, so that's what worries me nowadays, because everybody thinks, Amazon, Google, and maybe the FANG stocks, they can't go down, but they thought the same thing about GE. Look at GE right here. This stock went down 90% and still has never recovered. It's not even back to your purchase price if you were buying it here and you refused to sell it, just back in 08, 09, or prior to this decline.
Yeah, and you, I think you mentioned Cisco. How Cisco had such great earnings, but Cisco topped in the year 2000, and now so many years, decades, now 2 decades later, Cisco still has not surpassed that high. And even though it might be cheap, it has underperformed for 20 years. So just because something is a quality known name and a blue chip and maybe might have a low PE, that's not a reason for you to buy that stock.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a safe stock. They're all stocks are risky, and they can get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And we've heard people say, well, we see stocks go down. They're down 50% or even down 80 or 90%. I mean, how much lower can they go? The stock's down 90%, right? How much lower can it go? Another 10%? No. From wherever you buy the stock, it could go down 100%. Your risk is always 100%. So just looking at the example here of Crocs, stock comes off the first 50%. All right, you buy it there. Okay, comes off another 50%. Someone else buys it there, comes off another 50%, another 50%, just keeps cutting it. It could be 90%. This number could be any number from 0 to 100%. Your risk is always 100%. So don't think just because the stock has gone down, precipitously, or if it's down 80 or 90%, how much lower can it go? 100%. 100%. That's how much lower it can go.